to the Leeds Theosophical Society. What we're running this afternoon is actually something called the School of Applied Wisdom. And one of the problems with various esoteric traditions is that it's often about theory and not about really what goes on in people's everyday lives. You know, there's the theory over here, and then there are our mundane, difficult lives here, and the two don't often meet up. But the Ageless Wisdom has got numerous things in it which can be of enormous practical help to us as we struggle through each of our physical lives. But don't believe anything that I tell you. Really test these things against your own knowledge and against your own intuition. A lot of the things to do with the Ageless Wisdom teachings, people portray them often as being very, very complicated, and they're not. These ideas are actually quite simple ideas. And one of the problems we find in a lot of the literature is that people have a tendency to overcomplicate these things. Which is why these talks are based on this book, which I decided to write to try and present the overall body of Ageless Wisdom teachings, Theosophy, in 100 pages, so that people can read it almost like a school textbook or a ladybird book or something like that. It's been very, very well received, and I think there is an appetite now, particularly amongst younger people, and it's nice to see some people who are not my advanced age here this afternoon. I think people want more clear and concise answers to these big questions, and people want to understand what they can do on a practical level to incorporate these ideas into their lives and to somehow improve what they're doing. And we have to ask ourselves, well, what are we doing? So the basis of this talk this afternoon, and please interrupt me if you want to, I'm not just going to bash on all the time, is to take us on a long journey and to examine where we've come from, where we are, who we are, and where we're going. In other words, what's the meaning of life, if you like. And this is quite simple. The meaning of life is quite simple. The reason that we find ourselves in Leeds Theosophical Society on this Sunday afternoon is because we have an intuitive knowledge that perhaps this isn't the only life we've lived on earth, and that we are here for a reason. Now, mainstream religions and science still can't answer these questions adequately. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? But the Ageless Wisdom teachings, to some degree, do offer explanations for these things. And our purpose to go through all this complete hassle and difficulty that we face here on earth, as well as the joys and the pleasures, is for one simple reason only, and that is to help our own and the species which we come from, humankind, to evolve. That is the reason. Science portrays the world as this kind of accidental, purposeless, random accident that just happened. And lo and behold, we've got human beings on this planet, and animals and plants and minerals and various other things. There is a purpose to existence. Whether we know fully what that purpose is or not, it nevertheless exists. And that purpose is for us to grow and to learn. And one of the ideas is that we come into physical bodies, we come into this incredibly restricted world in order to learn things which we can't learn when we are in between lives on the subtle planes, if you like, in the more subtle types of reality. So basically, life on earth is a bit of a prison sentence in some respects, and Plato expressed it very well. I don't know whether you're aware of his analogy of the person in the cave. And their view of reality is drawn from the shadows that appear through a window high in that cave. They don't see the reality directly, they just see the shadows. So when we're here on earth, we are faced with problems and difficulties. And otherwise there would be no purpose to our life. If we just went on drifting from life to life, it would become purposeless. And everything is accompanied, all growth, all development is accompanied by conflict and by struggle. This is one of those universal laws called the law of polarity and the law of rhythm and the law of cycles, which insist that this is so. So let's look at this journey that we've come on, this journey which in fact is an eternal journey. And without getting too technical, we can say that human beings have been around on this planet far longer than conventional science is prepared to admit. The figure which is usually given is around about 18.7 million years, but we have to understand what we mean by humans. Prior to this Earth existing and being what we call part of a chain of other planets, there was a previous system based on the moon. And during that particular system, some human beings individualized from animals at that point. Other human beings didn't individualize until earlier parts of this particular Earth chain. So there are two separate groups of human beings, one of which is slightly more evolved than the other. That doesn't mean to say that everybody who evolved on the moon chain is automatically more advanced than people who individualized here on the Earth chain. It doesn't mean that at all. It simply means that they've had longer to do it. But people are at very different stages of development. The Ageless Wisdom teaching is actually based almost exclusively on the notion of cycles of one sort or another, which is why this book is called Cycles of Eternity. And there are numerous different types of cycle. The one that probably concerns us most this afternoon is the cycles of human development. So we talk in Theosophy about root races. This is nothing to do with racial theory or anything like that. These are simply development groups of humanity. And in the early stages of human life on Earth, there was no death, and there was no sex, and therefore there was no karma. Why? Because human beings only develop physical bodies towards the end and the beginning of the second development group, known as the Hyperborean. And we only develop the physical bodies that we have now during the third root race, which is called the Lemurian period. And also human beings in the past were basically just huge blobs of energy, ethereal matter. They didn't have hard bone structures. And also, they didn't have minds either. Human beings have only had minds for a relatively short part of their existence. And this hasn't happened easily. On two separate occasions, the human project has had to have outside assistance because we were doing so badly. And it's often called, these entities who came to instill mind in human beings are sometimes called the Lords of the Flame. So the human project is not really where it should be. There were problems on the previous scheme, and so we are at a lower stage of evolution than we should be. So it is said. However, evolution can be speeded up, and which is why most of you are probably in this room this afternoon, because you're interested in these big questions. Who am I? Where am I going? And where did I come from? And we don't understand our history. I mean, if you listen to the scientists, human history and civilization begin a mere 10,000 years ago. And yet we know from these very ancient teachings, which have been tested and rigorously investigated over the years by people in a position to do it, that we have been around for much, much longer. And so it's asked, well, why are there no traces of these previous civilizations of which we've been part, Lemuria, Atlantis? Well, because every root race creates its own habitat, its own land masses. When that root race has passed its sell-by date, if you like, or past its peak, then that landmass gets utterly destroyed. And this is what's happening on the Earth all the time. We know from the shifting of the tectonic plates, bringing things like earthquakes, that this stuff proceeds apace, and the Earth's surface is constantly changing. So we are now in the fifth of these development groups, called the Teutonic, or the area. The Teutonic, in fact, is the fifth branch race or sub-race. Each of these races or groups is divided into 7 further groups, and then further subdivided into nations, and right down into other groups and families and so on. There are numerous different types of divisions which exist. So we are in the fifth sub-race of the fifth root race. So there are still 2 full races yet to go, the 6th and the 7th. And when we get to the end of this 7th race, that is when this part of the human project on planet Earth will more or less come to an end. But that doesn't mean to say that human evolution will come to an end. At the end of that 7th root race, round about 2/3 of humanity, which doesn't just include the people who are alive, but people who are out of incarnation, around 2/3 of those people will have reached a certain degree of development which will allow them to move on to more elevated areas of development and enter what are in fact the superhuman kingdoms, where we will achieve almost adept or godlike status. Well, what about the third who don't make the grade? What happens to them? Well, they're simply held over into a future scheme where they will then become the advanced members of humanity in physical bodies. But at the end of the 7th root race, about 2/3 of human beings will no longer need to have a physical body anymore. And I find that quite welcoming, really, because physical bodies can be an absolute pain, as we all know. They have to be fed, they have to be clothed, they have to have all their needs ministered to. And so we look on things really in a slightly paradoxical way. We say, now, here, in physical bodies on Earth, we are alive. And yet, a lot of evidence suggests that we are actually less alive here on Earth in human bodies than we are in the in-between life states, where we have considerably more freedom and far less restriction. So why do we keep coming back into these human bodies? Because our souls are what are sometimes called monads, are individual eternal essences, tell us after so long in the after-death state that we need to do this all again. Because our lives are not only cyclical, individually and collectively, they're also operating on a kind of spiral. Now, this won't work in every single life, but with most people for most of the time, when they emerge into the next life, it will be at a slightly more elevated level. And I don't mean that socially or in terms of wealth. I'm talking about spiritual awareness. People will emerge a little bit higher on that spiral than they left the previous life. Which means that our lives are very, very important, because the learning that we do, the lessons we acquire, often through great pain and stress and suffering, are not lost. Nor are the skills that we learn in this life, whether they're mechanical skills or skills of compassion or skills of construction or skills of creativity. We use these in future lives. When great musicians come into incarnation and they suddenly start playing the violin at the age of 3 and composing symphonies at the age of 4, this is not the first life that they will have been acquainted with music. They will have served a long apprenticeship in many other lives, learning these skills and honing them and reaching the point where they can fully express all those skills. So our lives are never pointless. Everything we learn and every pain and discomfort we go through, as well as every joy and pleasure, has its place in helping us to evolve much further. But unless we know that this is the reason that we're here in the first place, this all kind of goes to waste. The religions of the past, and to some extent science, make us feel very small and unimportant. Christianity is particularly bad at this. Christianity makes you feel guilty for being born in the first place. Now, what God would want you to be born to feel guilty about being his creation? This is a nonsensical idea. But we feel that, to a large extent, we're powerless. And this is also down to social conditioning as well. But it's certainly down to religious conditioning. The wonderful thing about the Ageless Wisdom and about Theosophy is that it puts human beings at the centre of everything and in the driving seat and in control of their own destiny. No one else is in charge. There isn't some great big deity sitting on a throne throwing down thunderbolts when you don't do what he says. It's all down to you. And because we feel small, because we don't feel that we have any great power, we don't understand the immense and huge potential that human beings have got. We always downgrade our own abilities and potential. And we always find it surprising when, people of genius emerge, because we think, oh, we could never be like that. If we started to give ourselves the freedom to even realise a part of our capacity and potential, we could transform the world at a stroke. It's because we have been conditioned into believing that we're powerless that we restrict ourselves into boxes. One of the core aims of the Theosophical Society is to study and understand those powers which are hidden within human beings, and this is going to be the subject of the next talk. Understanding who we are and what makes us tick and how we progress through these cycles is actually of vital importance. And here we're going to have to pause for a minute to just look again, particularly because there are people here who are relatively new to some of these ideas. Just look at what human beings are. What actually makes us? What do we consist of? Well, traditionally people have divided human beings perhaps into two, into a mind and a body. Now, if you go into your Waterstones bookshop, you'll find that we have another part to us: mind, body and spirit. And these are quite convenient terms to look on, but they're a bit imprecise. So, in the Ageless Wisdom teachings, the human constitution is normally divided up into seven different bodies or components or vehicles. They're often represented like concentric rings, but this is a slightly inaccurate way of portraying them because all these bodies intermingle and are interconnected. So let's just look at these bodies, and we'll look at the permanent bits, the bits that we take from life to life, and the bits which last us for one life only. So we have a physical body made of bone and muscle and blood and all the other things. And then this physical body is animated by a more subtle body, which is normally called the etheric body, or sometimes called the vital body or the energy body. So this is like the, if you imagine that your computer is your physical body, then the ethereal body is the software and the electricity which goes into it. It's a slightly crude analogy, I know, but that's probably the best way to explain it. We also have a third body which is called our astral body. The astral plane is one that's very close to the physical plane, and it exactly mirrors all things on the physical plane. So everything in this room, you, everything has its counterpart on the astral plane. We all visit the astral plane every day when we go to sleep, or sometimes when we dream. Some people can access it consciously, people who know the techniques to use to gain astral travel. This is a world of dreams, a world of emotion, and a world of desire. But again, it's only a temporary body. Above that, we have basically two bodies in one. We have what we call mind. But in the Ageless Wisdom tradition, mind is divided strictly into two components. A lower mind, a concrete mind, and a higher mind. The concrete mind is concerned with just mundane and everyday thoughts. The higher mind is concerned with much more lofty things, philosophy, the appreciation of beauty, creating big ideas, philanthropic works and that sort of thing. And then above that we have what we call an intuitive body. This is called in Sanskrit buddhi. And then at the top of the tree we have something we just described as pure spirit. So we have four lower principles: physical body, etheric body, astral body and lower mind. And these last us for a single life. They make up what's called the transient personality. The three higher bodies, higher mind, the intuition and spirit, that triangle, they form our permanent individuality, or as it's called sometimes, permanent ego, or our souls, if you like. These are the permanent things. They change subtly from life to life, but essentially they are the same. With each life on earth we take on a new personality and a new body. In fact, the word personality is a very accurate word to describe it, because the word persona comes from the Greek word for mask. And one of the analogies that's often used when we talk about reincarnation is that we come into each life almost like an actor in a repertory company. So in one life we're playing Henry V, in the next life we're playing Cleopatra, in the next life we're playing Bottom, in the next life we're playing Cordelia. And we do this, we go through all these different ranges of lives in order to experience as many different things as possible. So it means we reincarnate in all social groups, in all racial groups, as men and women, as people of privilege and power, as people who are poor and destitute, and all degrees in between. And we have to go through all these things in order to get that full range of experience to make us fuller people. I'm going to pause there for a minute because I'm sure that somebody will have something to say about what I've said so far. Yes?
You said at the start that mankind separated very early on. Those that stayed within this sort of planet progressed quite slowly, and you've got the other on the moon. Do you mean by that like literally, or do you mean extraterrestrial?
No, I'm not talking about extraterrestrials, I'm talking about human beings. But you have to understand that the early human beings, as I said, were nothing like the human beings today. They were just like vast, if you can imagine, like vast amoeba. And that's how they used to actually reproduce. During the first and second root races, they used to actually reproduce like amoeba, either by fission, by splitting, or as some very primitive organisms do, by a process of budding. So that you produce another version of yourself and it just splits off. It's only when we get to a certain point, and at that point where we get mind, where you actually develop two sexes. Prior to that, human beings were essentially hermaphroditic and asexual.
Where are these things now?
Well, they're extinct because they've fulfilled their evolutionary use, and so there are no existing members of the first or second root races left. There will be people who still have characteristics of Lemuria and Atlantis within them, but these are not necessarily physical characteristics. These will be more to do with emotional and mental characteristics. It's not, you know, you don't get Lemurian people who look like the people who come from Lemuria, but they would still have some of those characteristics and traits.
Are the Lemurians meant to be feared?
Meant to be?
Feared, are they quite...
Well, compared to us, they were perhaps less sophisticated, but the Lemurians did manage to build great civilizations. I mean, the Lemurian landmass extended more or less between Australia and India and the east coast of Africa. It fills up basically large parts of the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, so it's said. And the only bits that will remain of Lemuria are places like Easter Island, and some of the Pacific islands will be landmasses, just as the Azores, the Canary Islands, parts of the Caribbean are ancient remnants of Atlantis. Because you've got to remember that these civilizations lasted for a very, very long time, and Atlantis lasted for well over 1.5 million years, and it got destroyed progressively in a number of stages, separated often by 500,000 years. So it didn't all happen at once. These things extend over, you know, vast periods of time. All this is kind of explained to some degree in this book, so I don't want to try and get too technical. Just lady at the back there.
I wanted to know the characteristics of those two, the first and the second one of Atlantis, what she said.
The Lemurians.
Yeah, what characteristics?
Well, the Lemurians, somewhere early on in their existence, probably around the second or third subrace, that's when they started to develop intellectual capacities. And because they developed intellectual capacities, that actually had an impact on the bodies. So initially, the bodies would have been huge, and every single culture on Earth has got myths and legends about giants, hasn't it? I can't think of one that hasn't. And this is where it comes from. It's not just some part of the fertile human imagination. It is based on a reality. So the Lemurians developed relatively quickly, but they were highly emotional people, and they were subject to lots of conflict and wars. I mean, nothing changes, does it, really? Except we're slightly more sophisticated. The Atlanteans are said to have created civilizations far in advance of the one that we have at the moment now.
I'd just like to say that when you said we're sophisticated, we're not sophisticated because we haven't actually learned the lesson of that. So
Well,
no.
We haven't learned the lessons of, you know, the futility of solving human conflict by war yet. But that is something that we will either learn or we'll destroy ourselves in the process of trying to do it. And
Then from what you've said there, you can see where the 6th and the 7th would come in, because we haven't actually grasped that concept for the ones to follow.
well, indeed, and I think one of the chief problems that stop human beings from getting on with each other, and I have to say this, has been religion.
Mm-hmm.
You know, religion is responsible, and it's not just me saying this. Many esoteric writers and elevated people have said that religion is responsible for the lion's share of the world's problems.
Do you not think it's more about survival and security? It
No.
comes first, and then religion is like boundary, and for people to stay in a certain state, so they don't think beyond and just keep them controlled.
I think that's exactly what religions have been. I mean, in the early stages, they may have helped human beings with a primitive sense of morality and right and wrong, and knowing that there are powers greater than themselves, sure. But certainly over the last 2,000 years, and Christianity and other religions have been very bad about this. I mean, every week, you know, you read about religions preying upon each other. I mean, this morning I read about another of these so-called holy men, another guru who's been up on, you know, sex charges and everything. You see Buddhists killing Muslims, you see Muslims killing Muslims, you see groups within individual religions killing each other. It's not so long ago since Catholics and Protestants were murdering each other in Northern Ireland. So we haven't learnt these lessons. And I think religion, as you rightly say, has tried to keep people in their place. And it's tried to divorce people from God, if you like. Religions always portray God as transcendent, as being apart from human beings, whereas Theosophy and many of the religions of the East have had a much more inclusive idea that God is immanent, that we are sparks of the divine. And that's a phrase that's used often in Theosophy and similar traditions, because we are gods in the making. As I explained to you earlier on, we are heading towards superhuman kingdoms. Not anytime soon, I might say, but eventually, somewhere down the line, that's where we're going to go. But we do have to learn this lesson about conflict very, very soon, because, well, we are at the most dangerous point, I think, that we've ever reached in my life, with the possible exception of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. I do think we're poised on the brink at the moment. And whether those higher powers, who are said to be in control of the world, are able or willing to do anything about this, I don't know, because it's a very interesting idea. There's people for a long time have been talking about a new avatar coming to Earth to teach humanity. We had Buddha, who taught wisdom. We had Christ, who taught love. For 2,000 years, we've been waiting for another. I mean, there are many minor people who've come in the interim. But the problem is, do we want some avatar on a great white horse to come riding in to save humanity? Because there's a problem with that. And the problem is that human beings have, to a degree, free will. And we can't get somebody else to do our growing up for us. We have to learn, ultimately, these lessons ourselves. And this has been the big problem with religion, because religion doesn't want you to learn those lessons, it just wants you to obey and to follow a particular set of laws and precepts. So now that humanity is coming of age, and we could almost say that humanity is now in its late adolescence, it's just on the brink of adulthood. And so, does humanity still need the nanny influence of religions anymore? And I would suggest that it probably doesn't. And I think in the future, if we're going to have religions at all, we're going to have to understand that human beings are essentially spiritual beings. And that we're not just here for some random purpose or whatever. And so, I think it's time, if a new world religion were to emerge, it won't be based on faith and it won't be based on worship, because I'm sure God's far too busy to want to be worshipped all the time. You know, he's got far too much on his plate to worry about whether a few people get down on their knees every so often to do it. Did you want to say something else?
I was wondering, because we diverted from that, I want to look back at those characteristics of the Atlantis. Yeah, those, yeah.
Well, Atlantis was a very sophisticated place, and it developed all sorts of technologies. It said that it had very advanced metal technologies, it had flying machines, it had communications, it had almost communications as we have today. The problem in Atlantis was that, as happens with all these development groups, they split into two. And what happened in Atlantis, you got basically a group of people who were like the politicians and the scientists today, who were totally materialistic and just wanted wealth and luxury and power and status and all these other things. And they started manipulating a number of energies. I'm explaining it in very simple terms here. And they started trying to basically interfere with the vital forces of the planet itself. And what they got up to led to this division, basically between two groups of people, the goodies and the baddies, if you like, the lords of the dark face, who were the black magicians, and the other lot, who were the white magicians. And that conflict played out in Atlantis and eventually led to its destruction. But it didn't end there. That conflict has been played out on the inner planes ever since. And that conflict was behind the First and Second World Wars. It's behind a lot of the things that are going on now. And to me, it seems that there are very striking parallels. If this stuff about Atlantis is even remotely true, there are huge and haunting parallels between what happened then and what's happening now. You know, our absolute reliance on materialism, the way that materialism shapes thought, the way it shapes our philosophy, the way it shapes our social structures. It's all not about what we are, it's about what we've got.
So those characteristics, what you're saying there, will be carried in the future lives of our baggage, as coming back to the Vedic astrology, that the 18 months to come will be actually...
Well, human beings have got to learn their lessons, and whether we learn these or not voluntarily, we will have to learn them. I think it's quite inevitable that some form of reconfiguration is going to take place. Now, whether that is done purely physically or whether it has other components, mental and psychological components, I don't know. But all change is preceded by massive change, by massive change to the land, to civilizations, to towns. I mean, you look at the way that the Second World War reshaped Europe, not just politically or socially, but in terms of its architecture, because so many large amounts of cities were destroyed. But you have to destroy the past in order to make way for the future. And at the moment, it seems that human beings are being reconfigured in some way. And this was really the second part of the talk that I wanted to bring up, really, because it's always fascinated me over the last few years why there are so many people on Earth at the moment, given the number of wars we've had, given all the other things which kill people. Why has the population of this world gone up 300% during my life? From 2.5 billion in 1950 to 7.2 or 3 billion now. Why is it that so many people appear to want to be in incarnation at the moment? Has anybody got any thoughts on this? Because I'd be very interested to hear.
Why are there so many people?
Why
So you see an increase in healthcare and vaccines, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that goes part of the way to explaining it, and basically the number of very poor people in the world is actually going down. It's only, the people who are dirt poor now, it only represents something like 9 to 11%, whereas 20 years ago it was 20 to 25%. So, okay, you still get poverty. But that's the outward explanation of it. I'm more interested in what the esoteric explanations actually are. If you can just hang on for a minute, I just want to make this particular point. That I think humanity is at a very interesting crossroads at the moment. We've reached a certain configuration of circumstances where we're moving from one great cycle into another. And the circumstances prevailing here are so unique that a lot of human beings want to take advantage of it. Because we've never been in a situation, certainly in recent recorded history, where so much change has happened to so many people so quickly. If you look at the way life has changed in the last 50 years, it's absolutely unprecedented in terms of technological development, in terms of social change, in terms of our ability to destroy each other as well. So what are these great cycles? What are we moving from? What are we moving to? Well, round about the time of the birth of Christ, maybe slightly before that, we entered the age of Pisces, an age lasting approximately 2,160 years. And then after that, there is the age of Aquarius, which we've all heard of. The transitions between these two ages often can take a very, very long time indeed, and it's said sometimes that the transition from the age of Pisces into the current age of Aquarius may have begun as long ago as maybe the 17th century, which is quite interesting because that's when we got the Enlightenment. It's when science first developed, and Isaac Newton and the Royal Society, rationalism and all that sort of stuff started to develop. So the transition period is a very long one. And I think now we've reached a point where we are more into the Aquarian cycle, and we're coming out of the tail end of the Piscean cycle. And I think that the year 2025 is going to be that crucial point when we will finally make that transition. And I think the years between now and then, Paul as an astrologer might be able to fill us in on rather more detail than I can, but they're going to be times of change and turmoil. And at the end of all this, it may be that a lot of what we've created in terms of what we call civilization may have to be destroyed in one way or another. It may be that human beings have to be taught much more simple ways to live in which they are less reliant on technology, because it's quite clear from all the research and all the writing that's been done on Atlantean culture that it was totally dependent on technology. It had the same kind of fetish for technology and science and that sort of thing that we have today. I mean, I'm not against science, please don't get me wrong, I think science is absolutely fantastic. And it struck me the other day as I was watching a documentary about Cassini and its mission to Saturn, this thing that's taken 30 years. If human beings from virtually every country in the world can cooperate to do something as complicated as that, why can't they sort out other problems in a similar fashion? To me, that seems a great paradox, that if we can work together in the spirit of cooperation and adventure and exploration, why can't we do it in the normal course of our lives? Answers on a postcard, please. Right, anybody else wanted to yes?
Earlier in your talk you said something about lords of fire, firemen. What role do they play in
Well, these are a group of entities called the Lords of the Flame. They come under various names. If you read Madame Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine, there are at least 32 separate names for them, all of them in Sanskrit. Flame is meant to represent the idea of mind, you know, that it kind of burns and has a certain energy to it. These entities are said to have come from another scheme, and they were brought in because human beings were so sluggish in being able to develop their own minds quickly enough, and so they needed some sort of outside stimulus. It's all in the Secret Doctrine if you want to read that, if you can bear to power your way through that. And they came, basically, the best way to describe them is as you would use a catalyst in a chemical reaction to make something happen more quickly. Human beings would have developed mind, but it would have taken apparently much, much longer for them to do that. And so, because things were already apparently behind schedule, it was necessary to add this accelerant to the human mix in order that we would develop consciousness more quickly.
Would they have been giants?
They probably wouldn't have had physical bodies at all. There would be entities, because we have to understand, and this is something which is really difficult for people of a materialistic mind to understand, that there are other levels of reality. There are entities which live on this planet, which we can't easily see because they don't operate on the physical plane, they operate on the more subtle levels, like the etheric. I mean, there are people with etheric vision. There are a number of people throughout history who can see certain things, and I think human beings probably until the start of the Industrial Revolution, when more people lived in the country, before there was light everywhere, I think that human beings are much more in touch with these entities. And again, you look at every culture on Earth and you look at folk legends and mythology, fairy stories, ghosts, all sorts of things. Everybody talks about them. And if you read the folklore of Britain, there were little entities which just belonged to one particular place, you know, one village or one tree on a hill or whatever, and people could see them. You can actually, on certain days when the conditions are right, some people can actually see etheric energies. If you stand with the sun to the back of you and you stare into a blue sky and you try not to blink your eyes, you'll get some dark kind of smoky shimmering in front of your eyes. Not everybody can see it. That is basically the etheric level. The etheric level is described as being separate from the physical level, but it may well be a much more refined part of the physical spectrum, because the physical spectrum at the moment consists of solids, liquids, gases, maybe plasma. Well, there are said to be 4 etheric states of matter, each one finer than the last one. So it may be that certain entities are belonging to different categories of this. We talk about the elemental kingdoms of nature, which are the 3 kingdoms below the mineral kingdom. So nature spirits, which most people in the Western world just think are, you know, complete fabrication. They think, you know, oh, he's away with the fairies. But there are plenty of people that do see these entities. And usually people see them in terms of their own culture. So if you are an Irish peasant in the 17th century, you probably see a little leprechaun dressed in green with a hat on. If you are in the deserts of North Africa, you'll call it a djinn, and you'll see it as a little whirlwind skipping across the desert. If you're in another part of the world, you might see it as a spirit totem. If you're a Native American member of the Hopi tribe or the Apaches, you may see a spirit bird or something like that. So it happens in all cultures. The problem is that we're so indoctrinated against this sort of thing now, we don't believe that anything can exist beyond the physical. And this is the great difficulty. This is the great difficulty science has got. But I think this problem is going to be solved very quickly because science now has basically fessed up to the fact, oh, we can only see about 6% of the universe. And the rest it describes as dark energy and dark matter. I think a lot of us believe that dark energy and dark matter